The year was 1852, deep in the heart of the American South. On the surface, the plantation seemed like countless others, sprawling cotton fields, rows of cabins, and the great white house looming above it all like a crown. But inside its walls, something twisted was brewing. A decision so cruel, so unthinkable, that even in an age built on human bondage, it stood apart. The plantation master was a man obsessed with power. Power over his land, power over the people he enslaved, and most disturbingly, power over his own family. His daughter, a young woman mocked for her size, hidden from society, and shamed by her father's own words, became the centerpiece of a nightmare. One night, in an act that blurred the line between cruelty and madness, he made a decision. He summoned one of the enslaved men, a man who had no choice but to obey, and forced upon him a task that no human being should ever endure. The daughter was offered up like an object, her body treated not with dignity, but as a weapon in her father's twisted experiment. What happened next was whispered about in hushed tones for generations. It left scars not only on the enslaved, not only on the young woman, but on everyone who bore witness. Some say it was punishment, others insist it was for profit, but all accounts agree on one chilling truth. What he did to her body changed everything. This is the story that Southern history tried to bury. And once you hear it, you'll understand why. Welcome to Truth Uncaged, the place where history's shadows refuse to stay hidden. Here we do not tell the polished stories written in textbooks. We confront the dark corners, the buried secrets, and the truths too disturbing for polite society to speak aloud. Tonight, we descended into the heart of the antebellum South, where one plantation owner crossed a line so grotesque that even fellow slaveholders whispered his name with disgust. A man whose cruelty did not stop at the fields or at the whip, but reached into his own home and his own daughter's life. Before we go deeper, I want to hear your thoughts. Do you believe these stories should be preserved and retold, no matter how painful, so we can understand the full weight of what slavery really was? Or should they remain sealed away in silence, locked inside dusty ledgers and whispered memories? Let us know in the comments below, because what you're about to hear is not just a story of cruelty. It is a reminder of how power, unchecked, can twist into something unspeakable. Now, let us step back into Georgia, 1852, a time when slavery was not only law but culture. And within that world, one man's obsession would create a secret too horrific to ignore. The plantation stood like a kingdom of shadows across the Georgia countryside. To outsiders it looked prosperous, fields of cotton rolling endlessly, a mansion rising proud above the land. But for those forced to work its soil, it was a prison of flesh and bone, where every sunrise brought only more suffering. Wealth here was not measured in coins, but in human bodies, bought and broken to build a legacy of power. Inside the mansion, the master's daughter lived in seclusion. Rarely seen in town, she became the subject of whispered rumors. People said she was too large, too awkward, too far removed from the fragile beauty that Southern society demanded of its women. Suitors arrived only to leave with polite excuses, their eyes betraying quiet disgust. Each rejection fed the whispers in the community and stoked the fury of her father, who saw her not as a child to be loved, but as a reflection of his own pride, and now his shame. To him, her body was more than a private disappointment. It was an open wound on his reputation. Neighbors smirked, rivals mocked behind closed doors, and every insult festered in his mind until it hardened into something darker. By the firelight of his study, with whiskey burning in his throat, he began to contemplate a solution. Not one born of kindness or compassion, but of control. He would not send her away. He would not allow her to remain an object of ridicule. Instead, he would bend others to his will, twisting the lives of those beneath him to cleanse what he saw as a stain upon his bloodline. It was here, in those quiet nights, that a plan began to take root. A plan that would leave scars deeper than the fields ever bore, and a secret so vile it would haunt the very soil of Georgia itself. It began quietly, almost too quietly to notice. The slaves on the plantation were the first to sense it. Small, unsettling details that ordinary eyes might have ignored. At the far end of the mansion, a room was kept locked at all times. Its windows were sealed, its curtains drawn. Servants carried trays of food there, yet no one ever saw who ate from them. At night, the silence of the house was broken by footsteps in the halls, heavy and uneven, followed by the low murmur of the master's voice. Sometimes servants swore they heard cries, muffled, restrained, as though someone inside that locked room tried to call out, only to be swallowed back into silence. They dared not speak of it openly, but the fear lingered in every corner of the house. Even the daughter's behavior began to change. Once hidden from sight, she now appeared in the courtyard at strange hours. Her clothes were often unkempt, her hair undone, her eyes carrying a distant, vacant look that unsettled those who saw her. She seemed less like a young woman and more like a prisoner inside her own body. Whispers spread in the quarters of the enslaved. Some said the master had locked one of the strongest men in the house with her, forcing them into an arrangement neither wanted. Others said it was worse, that she had been turned into an instrument for her father's cruel designs. No one dared to confront the truth, but in the shadows of the plantation, a chilling realization grew. Something was happening in that locked room, something that could not remain hidden forever. It did not take long before the whispers hardened into suspicion. The enslaved workers, who saw everything yet were forced to speak nothing, noticed changes that could no longer be explained away. A man, strong and defiant by nature, was suddenly absent from the fields. His presence, once a constant under the blazing sun, vanished overnight. When he did reappear, his eyes carried a hollow look, broken as if something had been stolen from him. At the same time, the daughter's transformation could no longer be ignored. Her reclusive silence gave way to a strange, unsettling rhythm. She was seen moving slowly through the house, her body altered in ways that could not be mistaken. Servants exchanged uneasy glances, their fears unspoken but written across their faces. What had once been whispered now stood before them in undeniable form. Behind closed doors, rumors grew sharper. Some claimed the master himself had forced one of his strongest slaves into the chamber with her, demanding he do what no man would choose. Others said it was not simply an act of cruelty, but a calculated design to breed her with those he owned, to twist her shame into some grotesque inheritance. But the house had cracks, and secrets cannot remain buried forever. The slaves spoke in hushed tones at night, recounting the noises, the cries, the unmistakable signs of what was unfolding in that locked room. Every detail added weight to the horror, painting a picture too cruel for the human mind to accept. What was once speculation had now become evidence, living, breathing, impossible to ignore. And yet the most disturbing truth had only begun to surface, because what the master sought was not simply control over his daughter's body, but dominion over life itself. The whispers became impossible to ignore when the daughter's body betrayed the secret her father tried to contain. Her shape changed, her movements slowed, and the evidence of her condition grew undeniable. For months, the townsfolk had wondered why she had vanished from public view. Now, even behind the mansion's locked doors, there was no disguising the truth. The daughter was with the child. Among the enslaved, the revelation confirmed their worst fears. They had suspected what the master intended, but suspicion alone had been easy to silence. This, however, was living proof, and when the infant was finally born, its features carried the unmistakable mark of both worlds. Skin that was neither fully white nor fully black. A child who bore the cruel weight of her father's plan. The plantation became a place of suffocating silence. Servants moved like shadows, terrified of even glancing at the newborn. No one dared to speak of it, but every glance carried the same unspoken horror. The master paraded the child only briefly, then withdrew it into secrecy, as if to hide the very consequence of his own decision. But hiding could not erase the truth. The child's existence was evidence of a crime too grotesque for even the cruelest southern norms. Whispers spread beyond the fields, seeping into the town. Neighbors asked questions, and some claimed they had seen the girl in the garden, rocking a swaddled infant with blank, lifeless eyes. Others said the baby's cries at night pierced through the walls, echoing across the land like a reminder of what had been done. It was no longer a rumor. It was reality. And for those who served beneath him, it proved beyond doubt that the master's cruelty had crossed a line even darker than slavery itself. The birth of the child should have been the end of whispers, but instead it was the beginning of something far worse. For the master, one child was not enough. He had tasted control over destiny itself, and now he wanted more. What began as a single act of cruelty became a deliberate practice, repeated behind closed doors, as if he were experimenting with bloodlines like cattle. The daughter, once silent and hidden, became more of a ghost with each passing year. Her body bore the scars of what was forced upon her, her eyes hollowed into vacant pools. Some nights she was heard weeping softly, her voice carrying through the mansion's long corridors. Other nights, her screams shattered the silence, silenced only when her father's booming voice cut them off. The enslaved men who were chosen for her chambers became shells of themselves. Their strength diminished, their spirits broken. Some resisted, and those who did were whipped until their backs were torn open. Others complied only because refusal meant certain death. They were no longer men in their master's eyes. They were tools, forced to breed at his command. As years passed, rumors grew darker. More than one child was said to have been born of this twisted design. Some vanished mysteriously, taken away before they could be seen by curious eyes. Others were hidden deep within the estate, their existence denied even as their cries betrayed them. The plantation had become more than a prison. It had become a breeding ground for secrets that could not be spoken aloud. And yet the master did not see horror in what he had created. He saw only power. His daughter was no longer a daughter. She was a vessel. His slaves were no longer human. They were instruments of a legacy that he believed would outlive them all. Time moved forward, but the shadows of that plantation did not fade. Long after the master's death, stories of what happened inside his house continued to haunt the region. Former slaves who had escaped carried whispers of the breeding chambers, accounts so disturbing that even abolitionists hesitated to print them in full. To many, they sounded too grotesque to be believed, yet to those who had lived it, they were scars that never healed. As the decades passed, descendants of both bloodlines walked the earth, children who carried pieces of two worlds inside them, yet belonged fully to neither. Some were sold away like property, disappearing into records marked only with numbers. Others grew up within the estate's crumbling walls, raised under a cloud of secrecy and shame. Their very existence was proof of the crimes committed, yet history has no neat place to record such truths. Even today, local historians speak in uneasy tones when the subject surfaces. Some old journals discovered in dusty trunks and attics described the master's project, written with clinical detachment as if breeding human beings were no different than breeding livestock. In rare cases, genealogical research has traced unusual lineages back to that very plantation, suggesting that the blood of both enslaved and enslaved still runs in families who may not even know the full story of their origins. The mansion itself has long since decayed, but the land remains. Travelers swear they feel a heaviness when passing through the fields, as though the earth itself has absorbed the pain of those forced to labor, forced to obey, and forced into bonds that nature never intended. The cruelty may have been buried under time, but its echoes remain, whispering of a history too dark to forget. When we look back on this story, it is tempting to dismiss it as nothing more than a grotesque footnote in the long history of slavery. Yet it is more than that. It is a reminder of what happens when unchecked power corrodes the human soul, when cruelty is disguised as order, and when silence allows horror to thrive in plain sight. The plantation master may have believed he was building a legacy, bending bloodlines to his will, but in truth, he left behind only scars. Scars in the memories of those who suffered, scars in the soil where cries once rang out, and scars in the bloodlines of families who carry his violence unknowingly. What he called control was nothing more than corruption. What he called order was destruction. The daughter herself became a symbol of tragedy, used not as a child, not as a human being, but as a vessel for her father's pride and shame. She was as much a prisoner as the men he forced into her chambers, trapped by a cruelty she could not escape. Her silence, her broken spirit, speak louder now than any words she might have left behind. And perhaps the darkest truth is this: stories like these are not unique. They were buried, ignored, and rewritten, but they existed across the South, hidden behind grand plantation walls, erased from polite society's records. What survived came to us only through whispers, fragments, and the courage of those who dared to speak. If this story teaches anything, it is that silence is not innocence. To look away is to let cruelty root itself deeper. And though the house has fallen and the fields have changed, the echoes of 1847 still ask us the same question. How far will people go when power replaces humanity? The mansion has rotted away, the fields have been sold, and the names of those who lived through this nightmare have been scattered by time. Yet the story still lingers, like a stain that will not wash out. It lives in the whispers of descendants who wonder about strange gaps in their family trees. It lives in the unease of locals who avoid speaking too loudly of what happened there. And it lives in the silence of history books that chose to turn their pages too quickly. What happened on that Georgia plantation was not just an act of cruelty. It was the dismantling of humanity itself. A father who treated his daughter as an object, men reduced to instruments, children born into secrecy and shame. The story forces us to ask, when power is absolute, what horrors can it justify? And how many of these stories have been buried so deeply that we may never know them at all? Perhaps that is the most haunting truth, that this tale is not the only one, that behind the grand walls of countless estates, similar secrets festered, erased by time but not by the land itself. The earth remembers, even when people choose to forget. And so I leave you with a question. When history hides its darkest corners, will we look away? Or will we face them, no matter how unsettling they may be? This has been Truth Uncaged. If you believe stories like this should never be forgotten, leave a comment below. Share your thoughts, your questions, even your outrage, because every voice helps break the silence that once allowed such cruelty to thrive.